So you heard somewhere about astrophotography, but you don't really know what it is, what is needed, and if it might be something for you. If that's the case, then welcome to Astrophotography 101. I will give you a high-level overview over this hobby from the planning until the final photo is complete. This is View into Space. I'm Sascha from Switzerland, so grüezi miteinander, and thanks for watching my channel. So when I thought about how I could explain a complete beginner what astrophotography is, I came up with this process. In this video I will give you a high-level overview over the whole workflow, from the planning to the editing, so that you have a basic idea and you can decide if this is something for you and you want to know more. If you want to know more, I will actually create separate videos for each of the process steps where I go much more into depth of how it's working and what is actually required. And by the way, if you like this slide, it is available in the description below to download. So astrophotography as a whole is in principle to make photos with a camera and a lens, while the lens in most cases is a telescope, of some objects in space. And while in broad daylight is simply point and shoot, as you can see, it is way more complicated making photos of objects in space. And so let's start with the first phase, planning. There are a lot of variables which have to be taken into consideration to decide if you want to shoot, where we want to shoot, what we want to shoot, and what equipment do we need for it. So let's start with if. We need to look at a weather app to decide if there are some clouds, some haze in the air, if there's a chance of rain, if there are high winds. All these are the enemies of making a photo. There are special apps and websites for that, because our requirements when it comes to the weather forecast are a little bit different than for the general population. Once this is clear, we got the green light that the weather is favorable. Then we have to decide, especially if we live in a light polluted area, if we feel a little bit lazy and we still want to shoot from home, or if we want to pack all our gear together and go somewhere where it is completely dark. If we decide to go somewhere dark, there are again some apps, some websites who give us the maps, which show us exactly where it is the darkest within our vicinity. And now with this knowledge available, we can finally choose what we actually want to shoot. This is so crucial because the sky changes throughout the year. So an object that might have been ideal a month ago to shoot might not be ideal anymore, and some new objects are appearing. That is also something that makes this hobby really interesting, because it's like in a cinema. There's constantly new movies actually coming, and then a year later you have the reruns. So to choose the object, we can either use some apps or some planetarium software on the computer, and they have a lot of times some lists with today's best objects. So we might choose from the menu, or we actually might look in the direction which is most ideal to us and see what's just within this direction. We also have to see if the objects we want to shoot actually fits in whatever telescope we're using. And again, we might adjust that to the light pollution degree to where we're shooting from. So if we're shooting from a very dark place, we might choose a very faint object. And if we shoot from a very light polluted place, or if the moon is rather full, then we might choose a more brighter object. So based on all of that, we can now plan what equipment we need. What telescope should we choose? What filters do we need? Do we need a battery pack? And so on. So in our mind, we can make a checklist. So now it's waiting impatiently until the evening comes, and then we go to step number 2, the setup. This step starts with setting up our main rig. And with the main rig, I mean the mount, the telescope, the camera, the filters, and everything else that's connected to it. In a lot of cases, these things are already installed, so we only have to set it up. Sometimes we actually have to exchange parts, or based on that we actually move somewhere, we have to put more parts together again. Once we have done that, we need power, which means we have to connect everything together with the cables. And if we're at home, it's quite easy. just put it in the plug. If we're out in the field, we have to connect everything to a battery and ensure that there's enough energy there. And last but not least, this hobby is very IT heavy, which means we have to ensure that we have internet, that all the applications that require internet are connected. Sometimes we have a small mini PC at the telescope. We might have remote connections to a notebook. Everything has to run smoothly. Now, once hardware-wise everything is ready, we can start working with it. So the first thing we have to do is we have to align the telescope. Now, what that in principle means is we have to tell the telescope where it is pointing to, because at the moment it doesn't know it. A lot of telescopes today have GPS included, but still they only know where they are, but not where they're pointing. So what we have to do, we have to point them at a number of stars and tell them what the name of these stars are. And then they know where they are in the sky, and from that moment on, whatever we tell them, that's where they go. There's also a special type of mount called equatorial mounts, which we have to point exactly north. And we have also software supporting us with that. As a next step, we start up the automation software. That's the software that helps us handle all the electronic parts so that it manages over the night the whole shooting, while we might go to sleep. We might tell the software what exactly we want to shoot. We might exactly frame it. We might tell it how many times and when to autofocus, how many exposures to take and how long they should be, and so on. It's a little bit like coding a script. And we will also start up a guiding software, which, through a separately attached scope and camera, tracks a few stars and ensures that the main telescope moves exactly with the sky. I know that sounds all very complicated, and to not sugarcoat it, yes, it is complicated. So the learning curve is quite steep at the beginning. But to put it in perspective, not everything has to be done from the beginning. This is just to show you how a full-blown workflow will look at the end. So now that everything is set up, that it's tested, that we entered everything, that all the software is started up, and that it's completely dark, we can start the shooting. So you would think that when talking about photography, that this is the main part, the shooting. And while obviously it is the process step that will give you the exposures, it's the most uneventful and easy process. Because in principle, if everything is set up, all it means is pushing a button and the whole thing will be done in an automated way. But obviously, as stated at the beginning, if you do not use an automation software, you can just do the recording, the shooting with a dedicated software which just takes the exposures. And the big difference from daylight shooting to astro shooting is that when you just make a photo in daylight, you have an exposure time of perhaps a hundredth of a second. In astrophotography, we have exposure times from 30 seconds up to 20 minutes per exposure. So that also explains why it is so crucial that our telescope is 100% in sync with the sky, so that it exactly always points at the same place when we take these very long exposures. So depending on the exposure time and the available night time, which is much longer in winter than in summer, we might take from 20 to 500 shots a night of the same object. In addition to that, we also shoot some very special exposures which accompany our main exposures. These are dark, flat, bias, dark flats, a lot of fancy terms which in principle stand for totally black exposures in different exposure length and also uniformly bright exposures. All of that to actually calculate the errors that the telescope and the cameras might have out of the real picture. So at the end of the night, what we end up with is not one nice picture, but a gigabytes of data, which now first have to be processed, and that we do at the next morning in the processing step. And processing means we feed now all these exposures of the objects we took, plus these flat, bias, dark flats, all these files into one specialized software. And then we let the computer crunch it from, depending on how many exposures we have, from half an hour to the whole day. And at one point, the software is complete, and then we have one raw picture. Still not the picture we put on the wall, but just at least one picture we can work with. Now, last but definitely not least, we then feed this one raw picture into an editing software. Some people just use Photoshop, and others use a dedicated Astro editing software, which really is dedicated to edit astrophotography pictures. Yes, that exists. And this editing process might take, again, half an hour, 2 hours, depending on how complex the picture is. It has really something artistic, and also depends a little bit on the taste of the photographer, how the end picture will look like. The very, very final touch can then be given with some dedicated denoising or sharpening software. And then finally, after all this work, if everything worked fine, we have one picture in our hand. That's really great. And now you might also understand why then this is proudly presented in social media. You might have thought, why do they make such a big fuss of such a picture? But it is because there's really a lot of work behind each and every picture, and also some luck that the weather worked fine and that nothing went wrong. And trust me, there's a million things which can go wrong from here to here. So I hope this gave you a first impression, and I hope I did not discourage you by showing you all of that. Yes, it is complex. Yes, there is really a lot to learn, but the number of pictures out there and the number of people doing this hobby shows it is absolutely doable, and it's a very, very interesting hobby which shows you a lot of beauty you would have never seen otherwise. So if you found that interesting and you want to know more, please check out the separate videos I do for each of these steps, where I tell you much, much more and go way more in depth on what is needed and how each and every process step works. And if you like this video, please subscribe to the channel and give me a thumbs up. It helps the channel. Thanks. Clear skies, and see you soon.